The Senate just passed a 45-day extension of one of the most sweeping surveillance powers in American law under the pretext that Congress will use the time to negotiate some real reforms. But don't let that fool you. This is just the latest chapter in a long bipartisan habit of treating warrantless access to your private communications as a feature of the law, not a bug. That's because for years, Congress has known that this law allows the government to read Americans' emails, listen to their calls, and search their private messages, all without a warrant, without a judge's approval, and without the person being targeted ever knowing. And year after year, instead of fixing it, lawmakers simply extended. They kicked the can. They invoked national security to justify their complicity and to move on. So what exactly is this law, and why should you care? To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the days immediately after the 9/11 attacks. The country was grieving. People were afraid. They were angry. And in that atmosphere, one of deep national trauma, the Bush administration moved quickly to expand the government's surveillance powers. At the center of it all is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA court, created after Watergate to provide judicial oversight of foreign intelligence targets. The FISA court operates in complete secrecy. The government is the only party present in that court. And over time, it has become little more than a rubber stamp approving the vast majority of surveillance requests, according to government transparency reports. In the post-9/11 era, that already limited oversight was stretched even further. Government transparency reports show that in 2025, the court fully denied just 4 out of 287 surveillance applications, less than 2%. Under Section 702 of the law, that's the one that's been in the news, the provision at the center of the current debate, the U.S. government can collect the electronic communications of foreign nationals located abroad without obtaining an individual warrant for each particular target. It allows agencies like the National Security Agency and the FBI to compel U.S. telecommunications providers, like your email provider, your phone provider, to turn over data, including emails and text messages and phone calls. And here's where it gets complicated. When the government surveils a foreign target and their communications, it inevitably sweeps up the communications of the American who's on the other side of those conversations. The government calls this incidental collection. Critics call it what it is, a backdoor into American private lives. Your email to a colleague abroad, your phone call or text to a family member overseas, all of it can be collected and then searched without a warrant. According to a recently declassified report by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI increased its backdoor searches on Americans in 2025 by 34% from the previous year to more than 7,400 searches, more than 7,400 essentially warrantless searches of Americans' private communications in a single year. But experts warn that the number, alarming as it is actually probably understates the scale of the problem. Now, the government's going to tell you that the FISA court provides oversight. But it's important to understand what that oversight actually looks like. The FISA court does not approve individual targets for investigation one by one, the way a normal warrant works. It approves broad categories, things like international terrorism or foreign governments, for a year at a time, granting blanket approval covering potentially hundreds or thousands of targets. Who are the targets? According to one government report, queries involving political, religious, and media organizations or individuals surged from 227 in 2024 to 839 in 2025, a nearly four-fold increase in a single year. The same report found that the FBI has searched communications tied to Black Lives Matter protesters, members of Congress, congressional staff, journalists, political commentators, and campaign donors. The justification has always been national security. And for years, the response has often been, if you're not doing anything wrong, you got nothing to worry about. That thinking has always been the wrong answer, because once you allow one violation against one group, you lower the bar for everyone. You make it easier for the next administration and the one after that to expand those powers to an ever-growing list of people that the government simply decides it does not like. And now we have a regime in power that's repeatedly sicked federal government powers against journalists and protesters and critics, an administration whose own officials describe political opponents as the enemies within. So we don't have to wonder what happens when a government like this is handled a tool like this. Trump himself answered that question for us, writing on Truth Social that he was, quote, willing to risk giving up of my rights and privileges as a citizen for national security. Here's the remarkable thing about that statement. Just 2 years ago, the same president told fellow lawmakers to, quote, kill FISA, accusing the FBI of misusing the very same law to spy on his 2016 presidential campaign. He was right, by the way, to be alarmed then. But his objection was never to the weapon. It was to who was pulling the trigger. He's not alone in that reversal, by the way. Jim Jordan, the Republican chairman of the powerful House Judiciary Committee, spent years as one of Section 702's most vocal critics. He routinely cited a 2023 government report finding that the government had misused the program 278,000 times. He and some other Republicans, by the way, voted against reauthorization of this program in 2024. He championed the warrant requirement, calling it the only way he would ever vote yes. Just last April, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post warning, quote, until we pass a warrant requirement, the government's powerful surveillance authorities will always be subject to abuse, end quote. He's right. Then Donald Trump called him, and he flipped. The motive is not hard to find. If Republicans lose the House, as expected they might do in November, Mike Johnson is finished as Speaker, probably. And the next Republican leader is going to need Trump's backing in order to get elected and survive. Jordan tried for the speakership back in 2023, and he failed spectacularly. But by dropping this opposition to this bill right now, he suddenly has a clearer path to the top than he's ever had. Minority leader if the Republicans lose the House, and the speakership itself if they win it back. As Republican Congressman Thomas Massie put it, quote, I think what happens here is that Trump probably convinced the chairman of my committee not to fight. And if the chairman's not fighting, there is no fight, end quote. Jordan's reversal comes at a moment when the stakes for civil liberties have never been higher because Section 702 of the FISA Act no longer exists in isolation. Alongside the government's own surveillance capabilities is a commercial data broker pipeline where the government simply buys American sensitive data, sidestepping the Fourth Amendment altogether. There's also a growing arsenal of AI systems capable of analyzing that data at a scale no human could ever do. Taken together, this is a new beast entirely, a surveillance apparatus no previous generation of Americans would recognize as compatible with our Bill of Rights. And it didn't emerge from one dramatic vote, by the way. It was built through a series of quiet extensions, just like this one that happened this week, where no one wants to be the lawmaker who blocks it and forces reform. The Democratic Senator Ron Wyden warned this week that AI could allow the government to process vast amounts of data to identify Americans for warrantless searches. His conclusion: new tools require new rules. Congress so far has written none, and some of the most powerful AI companies in the world are already being pulled into this apparatus. Senator Wyden sent letters to the nation's top AI companies asking whether they would consent to their technology being used to surveil Americans. Anthropic acknowledged that it had already granted exceptions to a small number of national security customers, end quote, and that foreign intelligence information may include incidentally collected U.S. person information. OpenAI and Elon Musk's xAI did not respond at all. There's a simple reform on the table, a warrant requirement, a traditional individualized warrant signed by a judge backed by probable cause, the kind of warrant the Fourth Amendment has always required before the government can search your home, read your mail, or tap your phone. That distinction matters enormously right now because this administration has become notorious for using a workaround, relying on administrative subpoenas issued by agencies like the Department of Homeland Security to obtain Americans' personal data without ever going before a judge. Adding the warrant requirement would mean that the government could no longer go into its Section 702 database and search for a specific American's communications without first obtaining a judge-issued warrant backed by probable cause. That is the same standard that has governed searches in this country for 2 centuries. It is enshrined in the very text of the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause. No warrants shall issue but upon probable cause. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Applying the Constitution is not a radical notion. And yet Speaker Johnson has refused to allow a vote on the warrant requirement, twice trying to ram through his own version of the bill, one that lacks the requirement entirely and does nothing to curb backdoor searches of Americans' data. He ultimately succeeded, pushing it through the House this week with the help of 42 Democrats. The ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, the Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut, defended those votes, claiming that the choice was binary. Either reauthorize the program or let it expire entirely. That's not really true. It's a convenient fig leaf, a cover for lawmakers who chose not to take a harder stand. The law would not have lapsed. Surveillance could have continued uninterrupted through March of 2027, regardless, because it operates through annual certifications that are approved by a special federal court. What would have changed is the government's ability to add new targets without explicit statutory authorization. Companies could refuse, courts could get involved, and real accountability would be on the table, meaning there was no real emergency here. There was time to negotiate real reforms. Lawmakers simply chose not to. And that brings us to the original sin of the post-9/11 surveillance era, that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. That argument was wrong then. It's far more dangerous now, because the question was never really about whether you have something to hide. It's always been about who decides what counts as suspicious, who decides which communications should be examined, who decides which Americans end up in the database, who controls a tool that can dig into the most intimate details of your life and the lives of everyone you know. In a functioning democracy, those decisions require warrants, probable cause, and judicial oversight. In the system Congress just extended this week, they do not. George Orwell understood something about surveillance that Congress does not, or at least pretends not to. In his novel 1984, written as a warning about totalitarianism, he described a world in which, quote, nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull, end quote. Everything else, everything you said, what you wrote, who you called, belonged in some sense to the state. Orwell wrote that in 1948 as a warning, but how far are we really from the world he described? Your emails are collected, your texts are collected, your calls are collected, your face is collected, scanned and stored by surveillance systems already deployed by this administration. They sit in a federal database, searchable without a warrant by an administration that has already told you who it considers an enemy. The door to backdoor surveillance was opened after September 11th. It has been pushed wider every year since. And in the age of AI, when the surveillance state is being turbocharged and what remains private is shrinking toward nothing, Congress chose to hand this tool to an administration that has shown us repeatedly exactly what it intends to do with it.